Well, we've looked at a number of different marine ecosystems in our survey of marine ecosystems, which is the last part of this course. To remind you, first we looked at the ocean environment, then did a survey of a lot of different marine organisms, and lately we've been looking at marine ecosystems. And we've got this one last marine ecosystem to look at, which is polar ecosystem. So, of course, that's the Arctic and the Antarctic. Very different from one another, although they have in common that it's very cold. But the Antarctic, it's a continent. There's land there. Whereas the Arctic, there's no land. It's a big ocean. There's a polar ice cap that's changing quite a bit recently. So, this is where we're going to look at characteristics of polar environments in general, and then focusing on those two things that I just mentioned, that the Arctic and the Antarctic polar ecosystems are actually very different from one another. And the Arctic is a relatively shallow ocean that's covered with ice, and the ice fluctuates a lot seasonally, and so the requirements for living there fluctuate quite a bit. And then the Antarctic, there's also seasonal differences, seasonal changes that take place. Certain parts of the time of the year are a lot more harsh than others, but it's all geared around a continent and the ice extending out from the continent and contracting back towards the continent. And then we're going to look at animals that are common in the Arctic and animals that are common in the Antarctic. We'll also do a little of looking at primary production in those ecosystems. So, polar environments in general, out of the whole ocean, we've looked at a lot of different parts of the ocean. There are some characteristics there that are found nowhere else. For instance, in the certain times of the year, there's long periods of time when the Earth tilts that there's no more day. It's dark for a long time. And then there's times during the summer when it's light for a long period of time, depending on the season. And of course, the first thing that people would think about when you mention polar ecosystems is that it's cold. Obviously, it's cold. So there's a lot of ice, there's a lot of snow. It's very extreme in terms of temperature above the water. Below the water, it's a little more forgiving, not quite as harsh. The temperatures don't fluctuate as much. It doesn't get to be as cold. So if you're below the water, then it's not as bad as being above the water. And there's a lot of polar organisms, polar animals that spend a considerable amount of time, if not all of their time, in the water. Above the water, where this ice is and where land is in Antarctica, it's a pretty stable environment in terms of being solid to stand on and to move around on. And sometimes when it gets cold and the ice freezes, then if you're an aquatic organism, especially if you're an air breather, then that presents a challenge because you have to come to the surface to breathe. And if it's all covered with ice, then that's a big problem because you can't get out of the water to breathe. And so you have to find breathing holes. So as you move north from the equator or south, animals tend to be bigger and bigger as you get into colder and colder environments, higher latitudes, and that has to do with the surface to volume ratio and the heat loss. If you're small, you're losing a lot of heat relative to your body size. If you're bigger, then you're more insulated in terms of heat loss. But most of these animals that you find in the cold, the majority anyway, are warm-blooded. Of course, there's fish and invertebrates that are found that aren't warm-blooded, but They have their own mechanisms for dealing with these extreme temperatures that we looked at. But the typical animal, bird, mammal, they tend to be big. If they can, they undergo seasonal migrations. There's a lot of polar animals that are big enough to migrate. There's a few that don't migrate. And then in terms of reproduction, they're suited to reproduce in the cold. They come out onto the ice floes, or they come out onto the land, or they heat their eggs enough for them to hatch in those environments. So that's what you find in a typical polar environment. For instance, if you look at a marine mammal that inhabits the poles, and in this picture there's a sea lion, and the heat that it's giving from its body, if you look at that photo on the right, there's a human that's feeding this sea lion, and the human gives off a huge amount of heat, but the insulation, the combination of fur and blubber, really does a good job of insulating these animals, and they don't lose much heat. Very good insulator. Obviously, if you live in this really cold water, or if you come out of the water onto the land, you've got to be very good at keeping yourself warm if you're warm-blooded. Another characteristic are these seasonal migrations. So what you find with the polar animals is that if you think about the Arctic in the summertime, there's migrations towards the North Pole, towards the Arctic, when conditions are better for feeding. Sometimes there's a lot of food there, and it's a lot easier to make a living there. And then in the winter, you move south towards the equator. Most of these don't come anywhere close to the equator, some whales, but they still move away from the poles. And if you look at the south, then you see the opposite cycle, where the northern summer is the southern winter, and the southern summer is the northern winter. So they move in opposite directions, but towards the poles and towards the equator. And in terms of reproduction that I mentioned, there you have to be able to reproduce in a way that you're going to be successful and that your offspring are going to be able to survive. So one of the characteristics of animals, especially marine mammals, that give birth in these very cold places is that the mother stores up a lot of excess energy to feed the offspring for a short period of time, and then the young are born. They have a lot of energy, they have a lot of fat, they grow very quickly, and then typically these marine mammals are born on the ice, out of the cold, and then once they reach a certain age, usually it's not very many weeks before they start going into the water. And also, the females, they don't give birth to very many offspring because they have to devote a lot of energy to their young to be able to tolerate those extremes. All right, well, let's look at some of the differences between the Arctic and the Antarctic. As I said, these are very different environments. They're both polar ecosystems, but the Arctic is a sea that's covered with ice. Antarctica, obviously, is a continent. So the conditions are very different there. Conditions are very different there in terms of primary productivity and the seasonality of photosynthesis for phytoplankton, and then what zooplankton does to persist. And so if you think about the changes that would take place in a body of water that gets covered with ice versus a continent that gets covered with ice, and those are the type of differences that we're talking about. So let's look at some of these differences and do some comparisons. In the Arctic, as I said, this is water that's covered with ice. And so a lot of the Arctic, especially in the winter, is covered with ice, and the sunlight doesn't penetrate into the water, and there's not very much photosynthesis. There's no light for photosynthesis. Sometimes it's even dark throughout for months at a time. So another difference with the Arctic is it's a relatively shallow ocean. In fact, it's the shallowest out of all the oceans that there are. And so this seasonal changes in the winter when it's cold and all this ice formation, a big ice cap in the Arctic during the winter, and it shrinks down considerably in the summer. This is a change that's taken place very dramatically over the last couple of decades with global warming. And the Antarctic, though, it's a continent. You know, it's one of the continents you learn when you're learning the 7 different continents. And so you have this, it's not just a shallow ocean, but you've got a shoreline where there's currents and winds that result in a number of places where there's upwelling. And this upwelling delivers a lot of nutrients to the surface waters and provides a very productive environment for phytoplankton that are eaten by zooplankton. One of the things that we looked at was krill, and the huge abundance of krill and the huge productivity of krill and all the different things that it feeds, that krill are responsible for a whole different ecosystem, a whole separate ecosystem in a way, that make their living off of krill. That's how productive the Antarctic is some of the time. You've got a continental shelf, and you've got relatively shallow water. You've got sunlight during some of the time, but then seasonally the water freezes over and this ice extends out away from the continent over the water. So it's quite a bit different. And if you look at the seasonal differences between the Arctic and the Antarctic, then here's this has changed even since this figure was made. But if you look at the North Pole versus the South Pole, at the top, you can probably tell that's the ice cover in the Arctic. So you can see in the winter there's a huge ice cover that it basically connects Asia and North America. You could walk all the way, that's connected there. People were looking for the Northwest Passage for a long time, and they could never get through there, and there's ice breakers that are trying to go through there. So if you look at that in the summertime, you see how much less ice there is, and all this water that's around the continent of Asia and North America, Canada, Alaska even, it's water. And so during those times of the year, it's very productive. If you look at Antarctica, the change in the ice isn't so great. In the summertime, there's still a huge amount of ice there, and most of the continent is covered with ice. But there's parts of the continent that aren't covered with ice. And then in the winter, ice expands away from the continent over the ocean. And so there's a considerable change. If you look at that figure on the right, in the bottom right, you can see the outline of the continent. So you can see how much ice is extended out away from the continent. So both of these figures, if you looked at this, you could look this up on Google if you wanted to get a picture of the ice cover in the Arctic. It is very dramatic. In 1950 or something like that, compared to the present day, there's this huge change in how much ice there is that's covered in the north with climate change. Then another thing for us to look at are animals that you find in the Arctic and animals that you find in the Antarctic, some of the characteristics that each one of these polar ecosystem has. But we can do that on Wednesday. This is enough of a lecture for Monday with the deep sea shark first part. So we'll come back on Wednesday and take this up again.